He parked his car like he'd done 100 times before, adjusted his tie in the mirror, smoothed out the folder of legal documents on the passenger seat, and stepped out into the early morning sun with the calm precision of a man who believed the world would see him for what he was, a professional, a lawyer, a man simply doing his job. But before his second foot hit the pavement, he felt it, the shift, the invisible tension that always seemed to follow him when he entered spaces not built for him. The way eyes narrowed just slightly, the way shoulders stiffened, the way the door didn't open fast enough. Though the person on the other side clearly saw him standing there, a black man in a sharp navy suit holding a folder and waiting outside. A bank, doing absolutely nothing, and yet already accused by presence alone. Kris leaned against the railing casually, glancing at his watch, waiting for the elderly client he was supposed to meet, unaware that just 30 feet away, a security guard, behind tinted glass, had already picked up the phone, already used the words lingering, acting strange, and refusing to leave, and that in less than 4 minutes, 2 patrol cars would pull up, not with curiosity, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from a system that has rehearsed this scene far too many times. Kris looked down at his phone, texting his client that he was outside when the first cruiser arrived, wheels scraping the curb, doors opening fast, voices already firm, already commanding, already loud enough for passers-by to pause mid-step. "Sir, step away from the entrance," one of the officers barked, and Kris looked up, confused, unsure if they were talking to someone else behind him, but they weren't. They never were. And as he opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to say, "I'm just waiting for someone," the second officer's hand was already near his holster, already set to escalate what hadn't even begun. Kris raised his hands slightly, palms out, folder tucked under one arm, heart beginning to race, not out of guilt, but out of the deep generational knowing that things like this didn't end with explanations. They ended with bruises, headlines, or worse. And suddenly, the calm he'd walked in with was replaced by the choking realization that no matter how well he dressed, how carefully he spoke, how professional he looked, to them, he was just another body to control, another threat to neutralize, another problem to remove. And he hadn't even stepped inside. The silence between his raised palms and their tightened grips was louder than the sirens they hadn't needed, louder than the voices that began to murmur from the sidewalk, louder than the shame building in his chest as one officer stepped forward, the other flanking him from behind. And Kris said calmly, clearly, "I'm here for a client, I'm an attorney, I have documentation." But his words were treated like static, dismissed before they could land, as if his voice carried no weight, as if the sound of reason from a black man's mouth only confirmed suspicion. And then came the question, sharp and deliberate. "Do you have ID?" Of course he did, but he knew what that question really meant. It meant prove you belong. It meant justify your presence. It meant your skin has already spoken for you. So he moved slowly, carefully, reaching inside his coat for his wallet like it was a live grenade. Every motion measured because he knew even blinking too fast could be taken as defiance. But before he could pull it out, the officer closest to him barked, "Don't move so quick!" And suddenly, the hand on his wrist tightened, spun him around, slammed him against the stone wall of the bank, and the folder of legal documents slipped from under his arm and scattered across the pavement like shattered dignity. People were watching now, recording on phones, whispering, some stepping back, others just watching with detached curiosity, like it was a performance they'd seen before and didn't expect to end differently. Kris tried to speak again, breath short against the pressure of the officer's arm pressing into his shoulder blades. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I work here. I have a meeting." But the only response was the cold metal of cuffs snapping around his wrists and the hiss of radio static as the officer reported a non-compliant suspect, non-compliant for standing outside a bank, for being black in a suit without permission, for waiting in public space while carrying something more dangerous than a weapon, confidence. One of the bank employees opened the door a crack, peeked out, then shut it just as quickly when their eyes met Kris's, and the officer dragged him down the steps toward the patrol car, past the scattered papers that now looked like litter instead of contracts, past a woman who muttered, well, if he didn't do anything, they wouldn't be arresting him, past a child staring wide-eyed at the scene and being tugged away by a parent, whispering, don't look. And through all of it, Kris felt the heat rising in his face, not from the physical grip, but from the humiliation, the forced submission, the stripping away of every layer of professionalism and identity he had worn, that mourning like armor, now reduced to just another black man in cuffs on a city sidewalk. And the worst part, the part that carved deep, was knowing that no matter how wrong this was, no matter how much it hurt, there were people watching who still wouldn't see anything wrong at all. The back seat of the patrol car was hot, the leather sticking to Kris's wrists, where the cuffs dug into his skin. And through the closed window, he could see the sheets of paper still fluttering on the sidewalk like forgotten pieces of who he was. The legal documents he'd carefully prepared, now nothing more than trash to be swept up, symbolic of how quickly his identity had been discarded. He leaned his head back, trying to slow his breathing, but the knot in his chest grew tighter with every passing second, especially as the two officers stood just outside, talking to each other in low tones, occasionally glancing at him with eyes that didn't hold curiosity or doubt, only smug certainty, as if they'd done a good job, as if what they'd just done was protocol, as if dragging a black man off the street without explanation was a natural part of the day. And one of them pulled out his phone and began typing, probably filing a report that would twist the facts into something justifiable. Suspect loitering, acting erratic, failed to comply with verbal instructions. And Kris knew how these things worked. He was a lawyer after all. But no knowledge could protect him from what was being written into the record in real time. A record that would now have his name attached to a false narrative. A permanent stain made in under 10 minutes. He could see people still lingering, watching, unsure if they should say something or keep moving. And he saw one white man across the street filming and nodding in disapproval, but making no attempt to speak up, and a woman who passed with her headphones in, glancing once and then speeding up her pace. Kris knew their silence was louder than any words, because silence meant consent. Silence meant agreement, and he could almost hear the thoughts behind their eyes. He must have done something. Why would they arrest him for nothing? Maybe he was aggressive. He looked out of place, and then came the moment that stung deeper than the cuffs. The older bank manager, a white man in a grey vest, walked outside slowly and approached the officers with the casual confidence of someone whose opinion would be taken as truth. And when the officers asked him, "Did you call this in?" he nodded and said, "Yeah." He looked suspicious. "Just standing there pacing. We've had some incidents recently. You can never be too careful." And Kris stared at him through the glass, not in rage, but in stunned disbelief, because he had spoken to that very man weeks ago at a community panel on business inclusion, had shaken his hand, had even complimented his commitment to minority outreach. And now that same man, who looked directly at him but pretended not to recognize him, had reduced him to a profile, a risk, a body with the wrong skin in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the officer, satisfied with this convenient justification, shut his notepad and said, "All right, we'll take it from here." And Kris finally snapped, shouting through the cracked window, "This is illegal! I've done nothing! You know who I am." But the officer didn't flinch, didn't even turn, just said, "Calm down, sir. You're only making this harder for yourself." As if Kris was the problem, not the lie being stitched together right in front of him, not the cowardice of a man who had called him a colleague 2 weeks ago and now couldn't meet his eyes. Humiliation burned through him like acid, and he knew that this arrest, baseless and brutal, would not be the end of the damage. It would echo through his life, his work, his reputation, and worst of all, in the way others would now look at him. Not as a lawyer, not as a professional, but as a man who had once been seen in handcuffs in front of a bank, and for some people, that would be all they needed to decide who he truly was. Let's take a brief pause. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you or someone you know ever experienced something like this? Your voice matters to us, and we read every story you share. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now we continue. The squad car pulled away slowly, not in a rush, almost as if the officers were proud to give the neighborhood time to watch, to absorb the image of Kris in the back seat like a cautionary tale, his face pressed against the window, lips tight, eyes burning, not with tears, but with fury held behind clenched teeth. And outside, the fragments of his life still littered the sidewalk, papers that had once represented trust, professionalism, credibility now soaked with city grime, trampled by indifference. And as the engine rumbled beneath him, he could hear one of the officers mutter to the other, "Bet he's got priors." And they both chuckled, not knowing or caring that Kris had spent the last 10 years working pro bono to keep young black men out of cells like the one they were dragging him toward now, not knowing that he had spoken at universities, written for legal journals, or that the only record with his name on it was clean, spotless, built on discipline and integrity. But in this car, none of that mattered. Here, the truth was irrelevant and the assumption was gospel. And as they turned a corner, one officer finally looked back at him and said, "So what's your story, counselor? Forgot your ski mask today?" A joke, sharp and cruel, and Kris didn't respond, not because he didn't have words, but because he knew none of them would land in ears that had already decided who he was. And the officer added, "See, you think just because you wear a suit, you're different. You're not. You're all the same when we get the call." Those words hit harder than the cuffs, because they weren't about enforcement, they were about identity, about the deep-rooted belief that no matter how much he achieved, how well he spoke, how respectfully he acted, Kris would never be allowed to escape the skin he was born in. To them, he wasn't a professional. He was a problem with a heartbeat, and the uniform gave them the right to rewrite reality however they pleased. When they arrived at the precinct, they didn't rush to process him. Instead, they left him sitting in the car for several long minutes, parked in full view of other officers and civilians walking in and out, so that more eyes could confirm the image. Black man, back of a cruiser, must have done something. And when they finally opened the door, the officer grabbed Kris's arm with unnecessary force, dragging him out as if he might bolt, despite the fact that his wrists were still cuffed and his legs stiff from being pinned in place. Inside, the coldness of the precinct was less about temperature and more about tone. One receptionist raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The officer handed over minimal paperwork, and when asked what the charge was, there was a pause, before someone muttered, "We're still determining that." Still determining, after dragging him off the street, pinning him to concrete, ripping his dignity away in public view. And now, inside the belly of the system, they didn't even have a reason to hold him. Only a profile, only an assumption, only a gut feeling backed by centuries of unchecked power. And Kris sat there, wrists still bound, on a plastic bench against a wall smeared with old stains, under flickering lights, surrounded by other men who looked like him, but wore different stories on their faces. Stories written in trauma, in cycles that Kris had tried to break through law and logic. But now he was here too, in the same seat, waiting to be processed into a machine that didn't care if he was innocent, didn't care if he was accomplished, didn't care that he had done everything right, because the system was never designed to reward righteousness, only to maintain control, and control didn't ask for justification. It demanded submission. And in that moment, as he stared at the scuffed floor and tried to hold on to his own name in a place determined to erase it, Kris felt the horrifying weight of realization settle in his chest. He wasn't being punished for something he did. He was being punished for existing in a world that never meant to include him. Kris was stuck in the interrogation room for hours, the fluorescent lights above buzzing relentlessly, flickering just enough to keep his mind from settling, from grounding itself in some semblance of peace. His wrists had started to ache, but there was no one around to care. The silence was deafening, not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the kind that hangs over you like a guillotine, waiting for a reason to fall. It wasn't just the room, it wasn't just the handcuffs or the cold metal of the chair beneath him. It was the overwhelming, suffocating weight of being stripped of his identity and dignity in front of strangers who looked at him like he didn't belong, like he was less than human, like he was another statistic to be managed. A black man in a suit had to be trouble. A black man standing outside a bank had to be planning something illegal. That was the assumption, the equation that had already been solved in their minds. It didn't matter that Kris had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that he had been invited by a client to the bank, that he was just doing his job. None of that mattered. What mattered was the image they had of him, and that image could never fit the reality of who he truly was. The door finally creaked open, and 2 officers stepped inside, one of them glancing at Kris with a smirk that felt more like a sneer. The other officer was silent, his face unreadable, but the way he looked at Kris said it all. He saw him, but not really. He saw a problem, a threat, a potential danger. The kind of danger that didn't have to be proven, didn't have to be anything but imagined. "All right, counselor," the first officer said, his voice a mocking blend of condescension and disdain. "Looks like you're getting off easy. A little misunderstanding, huh?" He chuckled at his own words, the sound thick with the arrogance of a man who had never had to account for his own bias, who had never had to question the assumptions he carried in his chest like armor. "You know, we could have handled this a lot differently. You understand that, right? Could have taken you downtown, booked you for resisting. You're lucky we don't do that. Lucky we're being nice." Kris's hands clenched into fists, the cuffs biting into his skin as if to remind him that he was still under their control, still beneath their power. He fought the urge to lash out, to stand up and challenge their mockery, but he knew better than to give them the satisfaction. His voice came out low, steady, even though his entire body was shaking with the need to scream. "I didn't resist," Kris said, his voice carrying the weight of both his frustration and his disbelief. "I did nothing wrong. You're holding me here without cause. You have no reason to arrest me, no charge to bring against me." The officer raised an eyebrow, still wearing that smug grin, as if Kris's words were a joke, a punchline he'd heard 100 times before. "Yeah, right, nothing wrong. That's what they all say. You think just 'cause you're wearing a suit, you're special? You think you're above this?" He leaned forward, closer to Kris, his breath hot against his face. "You're nothing more than a suspect to me and to everyone who's ever seen you. That's the problem, right? You walk around with that attitude, thinking you can just play by the rules. But the rules weren't made for people like you. You're not one of us." Kris felt the words cut into him like a blade, sharper than the physical pain from the handcuffs, deeper than the humiliation of the arrest. It wasn't the officer's words that hurt most. It was the truth in them, the unspoken truth that the officer's world, the world they lived in, had been built on the assumption that people like Kris didn't belong in spaces of power, in spaces of success. People like him were supposed to be invisible, supposed to be confined to the roles assigned to them by a society that refused to see them as equals. A black man in a suit was a threat. A black man in a bank was a potential criminal. A black man who had made something of himself was an anomaly, an exception to be questioned and scrutinized until he proved he deserved the same respect that others took for granted. Kris stared back at the officer, forcing himself to keep his voice steady, to keep the fury from spilling over. He had spent his life learning how to navigate spaces that weren't built for him, how to push past the looks, the assumptions, the dismissive attitudes. But even now, in this room, in this moment, he could feel the weight of everything that had ever been done to him and to others like him. "Do you know who I am?" Kris asked, his voice sharp with the sting of an anger that had been years in the making. "I'm an attorney. I've spent my life fighting for the rights of people who look just like me, who've been treated like this their whole lives. I've been in courtrooms where the system tried to bury them, tried to erase their dignity. And now you're doing it to me, right here, right now, but you're not going to get away with it." The officer leaned back, rolling his eyes like Kris had just said something ridiculous. "Save it. We don't care who you think you are. You're just another black man causing a scene. You think your title and your fancy suit are going to change that?" The words hit Kris harder than any punch ever could, because they weren't just about this moment. They were about a lifetime of being told that who he was, who he had worked so hard to become, didn't matter. That no matter how high he climbed, no matter how much he achieved, he would always be less than someone else, always be seen as a threat, always be othered. And it wasn't just the officers in this room. It was the whole system, the system that had labeled him, that had labeled so many people like him before they even knew their names. It was a system that treated his accomplishments like they were nothing, like his skin, his identity, was a mark against him. Kris clenched his fists again, the pain from the cuffs, a reminder that they held power over him, but they could never take away his mind. They could never take away his soul. They could humiliate him, mock him, treat him like a criminal, but they could never erase the truth. And the truth was, he wasn't going to let them get away with this. "I'm not your stereotype," Kris said, his voice hard as stone, his eyes locked on the officers, refusing to look away. "I'm not just another black man you can toss around because you're too blind to see me as a person. I'm not your excuse. And you're going to regret the day you made this mistake." The officer stared at him for a moment, the cocky grin slipping from his face, replaced by something colder, something more calculating. Kris had seen that look before, the look of someone who knew they were in the wrong but refused to admit it. They wouldn't apologize. They wouldn't back down. But Kris had seen enough. He had fought for enough people to know that he wasn't alone, that the fight wasn't over, that this wasn't just about him. It was about everything that had come before, everything that was still being done to people like him, and everything that would continue unless someone was brave enough to stand up. As they finally opened the door and walked him out of the room, Kris knew one thing for sure. This wouldn't end here. It couldn't. Not if he was going to make sure that the system that had tried to erase him didn't do the same to everyone else who looked like him. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about making sure the world knew the price of silence was too high to pay. Kris sat in the cramped, cold holding cell, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead buzzing as the world outside seemed to go on without him. He could hear the muffled sounds of other detainees, their voices indistinct, but filled with the same frustration, the same hopelessness that clung to him. He stared at the concrete floor, hands still cuffed behind him, and he could feel the weight of his own anger building up inside him, pushing against the walls of his chest like a flood trying to break free. But there was no release. Not yet. The system had him trapped, just like it had trapped so many others before him, and for the first time in his life, he could feel the full weight of that reality. This wasn't just a bad day. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a reflection of a system that had been built to tear down people like him. No matter how much he worked, no matter how much he achieved, minutes felt like hours, and the tension in the air was thick, pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. He had spent years fighting for the rights of others, making his way through law school, pushing against every obstacle the world had thrown at him. But here he was, sitting in a cold cell, accused of something he hadn't done, and there was no way to fight it. Not yet. Not now. The officers had already made up their minds. They had already decided that he was guilty of something. Anything. They didn't need proof. They didn't need evidence. They just needed him to be what they had always expected him to be. A threat, an enemy, someone who didn't belong. The door to the holding cell slammed open, and Kris stood up instinctively. But the officer who entered just waved him down without a word, signaling for him to sit back down. The officer was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face that was impassive, as though he had seen it all before and didn't care. Kris recognized the look immediately. The indifference that came with the belief that people like him were expendable, that they were nothing more than obstacles to be cleared away, nuisances to be handled. The officer glanced down at his paperwork without looking up. "You're free to go," he said flatly. Kris blinked, confused for a moment, the words barely registering. "What?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the tension. "What do you mean? Free to go? After what you've done? After dragging me out of the street, cuffing me like I was some criminal? You're just letting me go?" The officer finally looked up, eyes cold and emotionless. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We've been instructed to release you. The judge is already on the phone." Kris shook his head in disbelief. "A judge? What judge? I don't even know what I'm being charged with. What, so now I'm just supposed to leave and pretend this never happened? Pretend that this wasn't a violation of my rights?" The officer's face remained unchanged. "The judge's orders, not mine. Don't make this personal." Kris's heart was pounding now, the reality of what had just happened starting to hit him. He was being released. No charges. Nothing. just a quick apology for the mistake they had made. But it wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern, a system built on the assumption that men like him could be tossed aside at any moment, their lives interrupted without consequence. This wasn't about a simple arrest gone wrong. It was about a deep-seated belief that people like him were disposable, that the color of his skin automatically made him guilty of something, that his mere presence in a public space was an affront to the comfort of others. "I'm not just walking out of here, you know," Kris said, his voice now cold and steady, though it shook with the anger he could no longer hide. "This doesn't end here. You don't get to just let me go and act like nothing happened. Do you know what you've done? Do you know what this does to me, to my career, to my reputation?" The officer didn't flinch. "It's not my concern." Kris's hands were shaking now, but it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was the unrelenting anger, the frustration that had been building for years, the pain of knowing that this was far from the first time something like this had happened, that this would happen again, to someone else, and to someone else after that, until people like him finally learned their place. But Kris wasn't about to let it go, not this time. "You think this is over? You think I'm just going to walk away and pretend this never happened?" Kris said, his voice rising. "You've humiliated me. You've robbed me of my dignity, of my time, of my reputation. You've painted me as something I'm not, something I will never be. And now you think I'm just supposed to forget that? To be thankful that you're letting me go? I don't think so. You've made a mistake, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The officer finally looked at him with a hint of annoyance. "You can file a complaint, but don't expect it to change anything." Kris laughed bitterly. "That's all you've got? A complaint?" He shook his head. "This isn't about filing complaints. This isn't about legal procedures. This is about the fact that I was treated like a criminal for doing nothing, and I'm not letting you sweep that under the rug like it doesn't matter." He stood up abruptly, his legs unsteady from sitting for so long, but he wasn't about to sit back down. "I'll fight this. I'll fight it in the courts, I'll fight it in the media, and I'll make sure you all understand what happens when you do this to someone. I'm not the only one. I'm not the last." The officer sighed, clearly uninterested in the drama Kris was building. "You do what you want. Just get out of here before we change our minds." Kris stood there for a moment, staring at the officer, the bitter taste of humiliation still on his tongue. But in that moment, he realized something. He wasn't leaving without a fight. And it wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever been dragged through this system and made to feel less than human. This wasn't about one mistake. This was about a history of mistakes, a history of being invisible, of being labeled before you even had a chance to speak. This was about the countless black men and women who'd been arrested, detained, and humiliated for simply existing in spaces that were never meant for them. He walked out of the holding cell and into the light, his steps slow but sure, his mind already working on the steps he would take to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else, to make sure that those who thought they could just erase people like him would learn that he wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't going to be silent. Not anymore. Outside, the world was still turning. People walked by, oblivious to what had just happened to him. But Kris knew something they didn't. He knew that silence was the enemy, and he wasn't about to let it win. The days after Kris's release from the holding cell felt like an eternity, a cruel, drawn-out limbo where everything seemed out of place, distorted by the events that had just unfolded. He could still feel the rough edge of the cuffs on his wrists, the cold, hard seat of the patrol car, the eyes of strangers judging him from every corner. But even more than that, he could still feel the sting of the silence that had followed him all his life. The silence of being seen as a threat. The silence of being treated like an outsider. The silence of knowing that no matter how much he achieved, no matter how hard he worked, there would always be people who saw him as less than. The world hadn't changed. The system hadn't changed. It had just hidden itself better, made the lies a little more subtle, dressed up the racism in nicer clothes and kinder words. But at its core, it was the same, and Kris couldn't unsee it. The hollow apology from the police officers, the offhand dismissal from the judge, the inability of anyone to take real responsibility. It was all part of a system built to protect the powerful and disregard the vulnerable. But Kris wasn't about to let it go. He couldn't. He couldn't let this moment pass like all the others, where people like him were quietly erased, where the truth was buried under layers of indifference. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice, for the rights of the voiceless, and now, for the first time in his life, he understood exactly what that fight meant. It wasn't just about laws and arguments in courtrooms. It was about fighting for humanity itself, for the dignity that had been stripped away from him in that holding cell, for the basic right to exist without fear of being dehumanized. He wasn't going to let the police get away with it. He wasn't going to let the judge's decision slide by unnoticed. And he sure as hell wasn't going to let the public forget that this was a story about racism, about prejudice that ran so deep in the veins of this city, this country, that it could no longer be ignored. The silence had to end. The first step in Kris's fight was to meet with his lawyer, someone he trusted, someone who had seen this kind of injustice before. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning, and Kris spent the night unable to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next, how to move forward, what his options were. He knew he had to act quickly. The longer this situation was allowed to fester, the more it would slip out of the public eye, and the easier it would be for the police, the city officials, and anyone complicit in this injustice to sweep it under the rug. The next morning, Kris sat across from his lawyer, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and an expression that blended both calm professionalism and the deep, knowing frustration of someone who had fought for justice too many times to expect things to be easy. "So," his lawyer began, looking over the files, "we've got a case, that's for sure. What happened to you last night is clear-cut. Unlawful arrest, wrongful detention, abuse of power, you name it. But we both know how this works. We both know that the system is rigged in a way that's going to make this a hell of a fight." Kris nodded, his stomach churning. "I don't care how hard the fight is. They need to know what they did to me. They need to know what they're doing to people like me every day. If they think I'm just going to walk away from this, they're wrong. If I can do something about it, anything, I will." His lawyer leaned back in his chair, studying Kris for a long moment. "You're going to need more than just anger and determination, Kris. You're going to need proof. You're going to need witnesses. You're going to need to change minds, because this goes beyond just the police officers who arrested you. This is about the system itself. The mayor, the courts, the public opinion. They're all part of this." "I don't care about public opinion," Kris said, his voice steady, his eyes hard. "I care about the truth. And if the truth means people need to wake up, then that's what I'm going to show them." His lawyer sighed, a deep, resigned sound, as if he had heard these words 1,000 times before, from 1,000 people who thought they could change the system. "I hope you're right, but I've seen this go the other way. You don't want to get your hopes up. People like us, people like you, they don't get justice in this system. They get their names dragged through the mud, their lives turned upside down, and the people who did this to you, they keep their jobs, they keep their power, and nothing changes. Do you understand that?" Kris's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He didn't need to hear the discouragement. He knew the odds. He knew the system was stacked against him, that every step of this would be a battle. But he also knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not this time. The conversation turned to strategy. The lawyer outlined the necessary steps: filing complaints with the police department, reaching out to the media, contacting civil rights organizations that had the power to amplify Kris's story. But the lawyer was blunt. This would take time, effort, and resources. It would be a fight, and it would be ugly. Kris would have to endure the kind of scrutiny that came with challenging the very system that had put him in that holding cell in the first place. That night, Kris sat alone in his apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally drained. He had hoped that by now things would be different, that the world would have changed, that people like him wouldn't have to go through this anymore. But as he sat there, watching the lights from the city flicker outside his window, he realized that the world had not changed. It hadn't even come close. He had been wrong to think that things could be fixed with just a few legal victories, a few reforms. The fight wasn't over. It wasn't close to being over. And if he was going to make a difference, He had to do more than just speak out. He had to bring the fight to the people who controlled everything. He had to show them that no one was above accountability, not the police, not the system, not anyone. He thought about his own childhood, about the lessons his mother had taught him, the lessons he had passed down to his own children. He thought about all the generations before him who had fought so hard for the rights that Kris now took for granted. Those who had marched, who had bled, who had been murdered for the same justice that he was now demanding. They had fought and they had lost, but their fight had paved the way for Kris to be where he was, to be who he was, and he wouldn't let their sacrifices be in vain, not for a second. The next day, Kris filed his official complaint with the police department. The form was long, bureaucratic, full of questions designed to make him doubt himself, to second-guess every detail, but he filled it out, word for word, without hesitation. Afterward, he took his story to the local news. At first, the reporters were skeptical. They had heard about wrongful arrests before, but Kris's story was different. It wasn't just about an innocent man being detained for no reason. It was about something much larger, much more sinister. It was about a system that had been rigged against people like him for centuries, a system that had worked so hard to keep him in his place that it couldn't even see him as human anymore. As Kris spoke into the cameras, his voice steady, his heart racing, he felt the power of the moment. This was bigger than him. This was bigger than any one person. This was the beginning of something, the start of a long, difficult road that might not lead to victory, but was worth walking nonetheless. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been treated like less. He was fighting to make sure the world saw him for who he really was. Not just a man in a suit, but a man with a story, a man with a purpose, and a man who refused to be silenced. And in that moment, Kris knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The phone calls kept coming, one after another, each one heavier than the last. Each one another reminder that this fight would not be an easy one. Kris hadn't expected the support to come so quickly, but it had, flooding in from every corner. Civil rights organizations, legal colleagues, even strangers who had seen the story on the news and reached out with offers of help. But for every word of encouragement, there were twice as many words of doubt, whispers from people who hadn't been in his shoes, people who would never understand the depth of the situation. "It's just a mistake, Kris," some had said. "Just a misunderstanding. Let it go. You'll make things worse." But Kris knew better. This wasn't about just him. It was about all the people like him who had been dragged through the system, who had faced the same humiliating assumptions, who had been treated as suspects before they were even given a chance to prove their innocence. And this time, Kris wasn't walking away. The lawsuit was filed, the press conferences were held, and soon enough Kris was standing in front of a room full of reporters again, his face no longer one of confusion, but of determination. He had seen enough of the world to know that he was walking into a storm, but he wasn't afraid of the fight. He wasn't afraid of the truth, even if it meant exposing the rot that had been festering in the city for years. Every time he spoke, it felt like the weight of the history behind him pressed harder into his shoulders. And yet, with each word, he stood taller. The city's response was swift, calculated. Official statements from the police department, an apology from the mayor, promises of reform. But everyone knew it was just a performance, a way to quell the public outcry and move on, just like they always had. But Kris wasn't playing by their rules anymore. Every day that passed, he was reminded of the battle ahead. The local media outlets had picked up his story, but their coverage was far from kind. The headlines were carefully worded to cast doubt on his account, to question his role in the situation. "Lawyer claims unjust treatment," one headline read, while another suggested that Kris was simply overreacting to a routine interaction with police. It was a game they were playing, the same game they had always played with people who looked like him. Deny the truth, minimize the damage, and turn it into a circus. But Kris didn't care. The fight wasn't about the media's portrayal of him. It was about showing the world that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was about a system that systematically dehumanized black people, especially black men, in ways that had been accepted for generations. It was about making sure that his voice was heard, and not just his, but everyone's who had been silenced for far too long. In the weeks following his release, Kris found himself in a kind of limbo, caught between the public eye and the private pain of what he had gone through. The calls from reporters were relentless. They wanted to know about the arrest, about the police officers, about the judge who had intervened in his favor. But no matter how many times he explained it, no matter how many interviews he gave, it never seemed like enough. The questions always came back to the same thing. Why did this happen? What made the police think you were a threat? Kris was starting to see the futility in trying to answer those questions. It wasn't about him. It was about the way the world saw people like him. It was about the way his mere presence, his body, was always perceived as dangerous. It didn't matter that he was a respected lawyer, that he had worked hard to build a career and a life for himself. It didn't matter that he had never been in trouble with the law, that he had never done anything to warrant suspicion. He could dress in the finest suits, speak the most polished words, and still he would be reduced to the color of his skin. He could be walking down the street, waiting for a client, minding his own business, and it wouldn't matter. He would always be seen as a threat. He would always be a target. And that, more than anything, was what this fight was really about. He had always known that racism existed, but now he could feel it in his bones, like a weight pressing down on him that never let up. It wasn't just the police officers who arrested him. It wasn't just the judge who had dismissed the situation with a wave of his hand. It was the whole system. The one that put a black man in the streets and immediately assumed he was guilty. It was the system that allowed people like Kris to be treated like criminals simply for existing in a world that wasn't built for them. It was the system that punished them for daring to rise above their station, for daring to take a seat at the table, for trying to break free of the roles that had been assigned to them since the moment they were born. As the weeks dragged on, Kris found himself becoming more and more isolated. He had tried to reach out to his colleagues, to the people who had once been his friends, but the silence he received in return was deafening. It wasn't that they didn't care. They did, in their own way. But the truth was too uncomfortable for them to face. They couldn't process it. They couldn't bear to confront the fact that the system they worked for, the one they believed in, was the same one that had held Kris in that cell, that had treated him like less than human. They didn't want to hear about the deep-seated racism that was embedded in every institution, every interaction, every conversation. They didn't want to see the truth, because seeing it meant acknowledging their complicity in it. But Kris wasn't going to let that stop him. He couldn't. Not anymore. It was one evening, after yet another round of interviews, that Kris sat in his apartment, staring out the window at the city below. The lights flickered in the distance, and for a moment, he felt the weight of everything: the lawsuit, the media, the pressure of fighting a system that had never worked for people like him. But then, something shifted inside of him. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing this for the people who couldn't fight, for the people who didn't have the platform or the voice to stand up for themselves. He was doing this for every black person who had ever been treated like a criminal because of their skin color, for every black person who had ever been told they didn't belong. He was doing this for every child who would grow up in this world, who would face the same prejudice, the same hate, the same disregard. And in that moment, Kris made a decision. He wasn't going to be silent anymore. He wasn't going to let them erase his story, erase his voice. He wasn't going to let them make him feel small. If the system wanted a fight, then he would give it to them. But it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, who had ever been ignored, who had ever been told that they didn't matter. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer. The words were simple, but they held the weight of everything he had been holding in his chest for so long. "I'm ready," he said. "Let's take this to court." And with that, the next chapter of the fight began, not just for Kris, but for everyone who had ever been pushed aside, for everyone who had ever been told their story didn't matter. The road ahead would be long, and it would be hard, but Kris knew one thing. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The day of the trial finally arrived, and with it came an almost suffocating wave of anticipation. Kris had spent the past few weeks preparing for this moment, preparing his statements, his arguments, his evidence, But no matter how many times he rehearsed, no matter how many hours he spent refining his case, the weight of what was to come still hung over him like a storm waiting to break. This was more than just about his personal vindication. This was about something bigger than him. It was about confronting a system that had been built on the assumption that men like him, black men, were guilty before they were even given a chance. It was about exposing the racism that lived and breathed in the very fabric of the system, in every interaction, every look, every assumption that people like Kris had to endure every day. The courtroom was filled with tension as Kris walked in, his lawyer at his side, his briefcase in hand. The room fell silent as the doors closed behind them. He could feel the eyes on him, the stares of strangers who had no idea who he was, but who had already decided what he represented. The judge, a middle-aged white man, barely glanced up as Kris took his seat. The prosecution, an older white man with a sharp jaw and a cold gaze, didn't even acknowledge Kris, instead focusing on his notes, as though he had already made up his mind about the case. The defense attorney, though polite, was just as detached. Kris knew that to them, he was just another black man in a suit, another statistic, another person to be handled, ignored, or dismissed. The prosecutor stood first, his voice smooth, rehearsed, as he began outlining his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "we are here today because a man, Mr. Kris Jordan, was taken into custody by officers who had every reason to suspect that he was involved in criminal activity. They acted in accordance with standard protocol, and Mr. Jordan's resistance to their inquiries led to his detention. This arrest was necessary. It was lawful. It was not based on race, but on behavior that warranted suspicion. We ask that you carefully consider the facts and understand that the officers acted in good faith." Kris clenched his jaw as the prosecutor continued, recounting the events of that day in the most clinical terms, stripping away the humanity of the entire ordeal, reducing the violence he had endured to nothing more than a series of steps in a legal process. As the prosecutor spoke, Kris felt the sting of the words, the quiet, insidious racism that ran through every syllable, the suggestion that his behavior had warranted suspicion, that he had resisted, that his mere presence had been enough to justify his arrest. These were the lies that had been spun for years, the lies that allowed the system to continue its unchecked abuse. When it was his turn to speak, Kris stood slowly, the eyes of the room on him, some curious, some dismissive, others filled with contempt. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, as if their eyes were searing through him, trying to see through his suit, through his education, through his status, and back to the man they had already decided he was. But Kris wasn't about to let them define him, not today. He stood tall, his voice steady and calm, but filled with an emotion that he couldn't quite hide. "I stand before you today not just to clear my name, but to tell you the truth," he began, his voice strong, unwavering. "The truth about what happened that day. The truth about how I was treated, how I was profiled, arrested, humiliated in front of a crowd of strangers, simply for existing in a space where I had every right to be. The truth is this: I was never given a chance. I was never asked if I was guilty. I was presumed to be. And that is a truth that millions of black people in this country face every day." The room was quiet, save for the faint rustle of paper. Kris could feel the weight of their silence pressing down on him, but he didn't waver. "I am a lawyer," he continued, "but that didn't matter that day. My years of education, my professional accomplishments, my good standing in this community, they didn't matter. What mattered was the color of my skin. What mattered was the assumption that I was a threat, the assumption that I was guilty before I was even given the chance to speak. And that is the reality we live in." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in, then continued. "The officers who arrested me didn't see me as a person. They saw a black man in a suit, and that was enough. It was enough for them to strip away my dignity, to throw me into a holding cell, to treat me like I was a criminal. It was enough for them to justify their actions with the flimsy excuse that I looked suspicious, that my presence alone was a reason to arrest me. But let me tell you something. What happened to me is not just an isolated incident. It is not just a bad day for one man. It is the reality that millions of black men and women face every single day. It is the racism that is woven into the very fabric of this country, into its institutions, into its law enforcement, and into the way people like me are treated. This is not an accident. This is not a mistake. This is how the system is designed to work. It is designed to make sure that people like me are always on the outside, always suspect, always a threat. And it is designed to keep us there. Kris's voice was steady, but the anger behind his words was undeniable. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for the countless others who had been arrested, detained, and mistreated simply because of the color of their skin. He was speaking for the people who had been silenced, for the ones who hadn't had the chance to speak up, for the ones who had been ignored, erased, and forgotten. And in that moment, Kris knew that this fight was no longer just about him. It was about something much bigger, something that stretched beyond the walls of the courtroom, beyond the city, beyond the state. It was about a fight for justice, for equality, for the right to exist without fear. "I am not just here to clear my name," Kris said, his voice growing stronger, more resolute. "I am here to make sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. I am here to make sure that no one else is arrested, detained, or humiliated simply because of the way they look. I am here to make sure that the truth is seen, that the truth is heard, and that the system is held accountable for the harm it continues to cause." The silence in the room was deafening, and for the first time, Kris felt like his words were actually sinking in, like they were reaching the people who had the power to make a change. He could see the jury, their faces unreadable, but he could feel their attention, feel the shift in the room as they processed what he was saying. They couldn't ignore it. They couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. They couldn't look away from the truth he had just laid out before them. But even as he stood there, making his case, Kris knew that this battle was far from over. The system didn't change overnight. It didn't change because one man stood up and told the truth. It didn't change because a few people were willing to listen. The system would fight back, and it would fight hard. But Kris wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to back down. He had spent too long fighting for justice to let it slip away now. The judge called for a short recess, and Kris sat back in his seat, his eyes scanning the room. He had said his piece, but the real fight was just beginning. The real battle would be in the days ahead, in the courtrooms, in the media, in the hearts and minds of the people who had the power to change the system. Kris didn't know if he would win this fight. He didn't know if he would ever see true justice. But what he did know was this: he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal battles, media attention, and personal reflection. The lawsuit, the media coverage, the constant barrage of interviews. It was all a whirlwind, a series of events that Kris had no choice but to navigate. His case had become a symbol, a lightning rod for conversations about racism, police brutality, and the inequalities that still ran rampant in the system. Every time Kris spoke, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been wrongly arrested, who had ever been treated like they didn't belong, who had ever been humiliated in the streets simply because of their skin color. Kris knew he was making a difference, but there were moments when the fight felt too heavy, when the world seemed too broken, when he wondered if the cost was too much. The comments online were brutal. He saw the trolls, the racists, the people who called him a race baiter or just another criminal trying to make a name for himself. The images of him in handcuffs, the headlines that reduced his entire experience to a simple story of a misunderstanding, haunted him every time he opened his phone. The system was never going to apologize. The people who held the power would never admit that what had happened to him was wrong. They would continue to hide behind the excuse that they were just doing their jobs, that they had no idea what they were doing to him, to his life. But despite everything, Kris pressed on. Every morning, he reminded himself why he was doing this. He wasn't just doing it for himself. He was doing it for every child who would grow up facing the same injustice, for every black man who would have to prove his worth in a world that had already decided he was guilty. He was doing it for the people who had been silenced for so long, who had no voice, no platform, no way to fight back. The day of the final verdict arrived, and Kris sat in the courtroom with his lawyer, his heart pounding in his chest. The prosecution had fought hard, as expected. They had tried to discredit Kris, tried to paint him as a troublemaker, a man who had resisted when all he had done was stand his ground. The police officers who had arrested him had testified, their stories inconsistent, their accounts full of holes. But still, the system had a way of protecting its own. The judge, an older white man with a stern face, had kept the proceedings professional. But Kris could feel the subtle bias in the room, the way the air shifted whenever the prosecution spoke, the way the jury looked at him as though they had already made up their minds. He wasn't naive enough to believe that the court would give him the justice he deserved. But he had to try. He had to make them see, make them listen. When the judge finally stood, Kris braced himself for what was coming. The room fell silent. The judge's gavel slammed down. The verdict was in. "Mr. Jordan," the judge began, his voice as cold as the marble floors beneath Kris's feet. "The court has reviewed the evidence presented and will now issue its ruling." Kris's heart sank, but he forced himself to stay calm, to focus. The weight of his family, his career, and everything he had worked for rested on these words. "The charges against you are hereby dismissed," the judge said. And for a moment, Kris couldn't breathe. He felt a rush of emotion flood through him. Relief, yes, but also frustration, anger, sadness. He had won, yes, but it was the kind of victory that came with a bitter aftertaste. He had been right all along, and yet in the end it felt like a small, hollow victory. The police officers would go back to their jobs. The system would keep functioning, just as it always had. But he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. As he left the courthouse, surrounded by reporters, cameras flashing in his face, Kris could feel the weight of the moment settling in. The media had followed him relentlessly, covering every step of the trial, every word he spoke, every detail of the case. They wanted a story, and he had given it to them. But the story wasn't over. It wasn't just about the verdict. It was about everything that came next, the work that still had to be done. Kris was met by his lawyer outside the courthouse, a smile on his face, but Kris could see the exhaustion in his eyes. They had won the case, but the battle was far from over. The lawyer put a hand on Kris's shoulder. "You did it, man," he said, his voice full of admiration. "You showed them. You made them see the truth." Kris nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "This was just the beginning." Over the next few months, Kris became a symbol of the fight for justice, a voice for those who had been silenced. He spoke at rallies, met with community leaders, and worked tirelessly to bring attention to the issues of police brutality and systemic racism. He knew that he couldn't do it alone, that no one could. But he also knew that the more people saw the truth, the more they would be forced to confront it. He couldn't let the system keep winning. He couldn't let people like him be erased, time and time again. But despite the media attention, the support from the community, and the progress that he knew was being made, Kris couldn't shake the feeling that something had been broken inside him. The humiliation, the shame, the feeling of being less than, those things stayed with him. The scars would never fully heal. He had been forced to relive his own pain, his own trauma, and the trauma of his ancestors for the sake of a cause. It was a cause worth fighting for, no doubt, but it came at a price, and that price was steep. As the months turned into years, Kris continued his work, continuing to fight for justice, continuing to speak out. But he knew that the fight was never going to end. There would always be more people like him, more people who would face the same fate, more people who would be treated like criminals simply because of the color of their skin. The system would never stop, never relent, but neither would Kris. He wasn't fighting for a single victory. He wasn't fighting for a single case. He was fighting for the future, for the generations to come, for a world where no one would ever have to endure what he had been through. And so, the fight continued. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but Kris wasn't going to stop. Not now, not ever. He had walked through the storm, had faced the darkness, and now he was standing tall, ready to face whatever came next. Because the truth, no matter how hard it was to swallow, would always come out. And Kris Jordan would make sure it was heard. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about the events Kris went through? Have you experienced racism or witnessed similar situations in your life? Your opinions and experiences mean a lot to us, and we deeply appreciate each and every one of you who engages with our content. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear more. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us. Have a great day ahead, and please leave a comment with the phrase, "The fight is not over," so we know you listened all the way through.